Globally, cities are the future. It's estimated that by 2050, 75% of humanity will be living in cities, an urban future. And between now and then, the planet will expand with another 2.4 billion inhabitants. Interestingly, in Spain, the proportion is higher, something like, by 2050, 84% of Spain will be urban. And cities are responsible for 70% of global energy, consumption, and emissions, which sounds like bad news, but the good news is that cities generate wealth. I mean, the GDP of New York City is similar, quite close to that of Mexico, is 4 times that of Switzerland. So cities are powerhouses of wealth generation. 1 in 3 people will be in informal settlements or slums without water, power, and already we can see the joining up of cities. Will they merge like villages have merged into a city, into a kind of megalopolis? What perhaps is new is the rate of that urbanization. If we take 3 cities, Lagos, Dakar, and Jakarta, 1 new person is either born or enters that group of cities every 30 seconds. To put that in the context of Madrid, which incidentally, as I'll explain a little later, is an extraordinary, very low carbon footprint, walkable city, very sustainable. If we take China, in China, in 6 years between 2014 to 20, you have 115 million new urban residents. To put that in context, it's 1 Madrid for every 2 months for 6 years. And it's very difficult to grasp the scale and impact of that urbanization on a kind of far side of the planet. And we're familiar with images like this in terms of pollution. And I can remember the great smog of 1952 in London, which claimed 12,000 lives and was finally sorted out by a political act, the Clean Air Act. But this is the equivalent of smoking for 1 day a pack of cigarettes in terms of health. And it's interesting that in November 2015, as part of new legislation to make Beijing cleaner, a red alert was instituted. And the red alert would tell you on a day like this that very shortly it would be like this. And so if we're looking at the effects of climate change, then it's no longer local like the great smog of 1952 in London. On a global scale, we all physically share it. It moves, it affects all of us. It's not just happening somewhere over there. And we may feel remote from the plight of the polar bear on a kind of melting ice cap. But the reality is that 75% of the world's cities are on the coast, and 50% of the world's population is within 100 kilometers of the coast. So really, rising sea levels, pollution, carbon, really, we're already seeing the symptoms of those, whether it's Katrina, whether it's Hurricane Sandy, and it's not just something that we read about in newspapers. What are the causes of greenhouse gas emissions? We can divide it wherever you start. It's transport and buildings, it's industry and the production of the energy, it's agriculture as a large section. And if we take that slice by slice, then the challenge is, how do we move from the dirty fossil fuel creation of energy, which we're dependent on at the moment, but we're seeing massive shifts in this respect. So how do we do that? How do we generate it more cleanly? How do we address the issues of transportation, which I exampled earlier in terms of that revolution, which is responsible, the movement of goods and people between cities and in cities. Buildings, as part of that story, there's already an awareness which has moved from the intuitive to categorizing it with things like LEED, which define sustainability, to WELL, which define the health of the inhabitants of the buildings, and agriculture. What kind of cities should we be striving for? If we have a choice in terms of urbanization, what do we learn from the past? You could say, if you wanted to categorize cities, there are three kinds. Starting on the left, and Houston is a typical example, very low density, totally dependent on the car. They sprawl. There's the European compact city, and Madrid is a great example. Density, 55 people to the hectare, very, very low energy consumption, because essentially the movement is pedestrian with good public transport. Manhattan, a prime example, more dense, more people living close to where they were, fantastic public transport, low car ownership. If we look at this in terms of energy on a graph, we start to see that Houston is way, way up there on the left. Very, very high consumption of energy. And right down below, dense, compact, livable, workable, and New York and Manhattan as even more so in that respect. So one would hope that urbanization in the future, there would be learning from these examples historically. But what are we seeing? We're seeing an embrace of the car-borne city. I mean, if we take, for example, Dubai in 1991, and then we look at it, the same photograph. If we took this photograph now, it would be even more urbanized. And it's based on that model of the car-borne, sprawling, energy-consuming, polluting city, which is also socially nowhere near as desirable as a city like this. And so there's a certain irony and very important messages to be brought out, because the new urbanizing world, while it is embracing the road and cars, meanwhile, those who've experienced that, if you take Boston and the Big Dig, that's been removed, and property values have doubled, crime has reduced. It's become closer to its origins as a kind of European model of a friendly, pedestrian-friendly city. And we're seeing the same thing here in Korea with the removal of a road. And we can see it here in Madrid, which I also enjoy, like the other citizens of this city. So that revolution in rethinking the very way in which we move between cities and in cities, that transport revolution that I referred to, that technology needs now to be transferred into the urban world, the environmental issues, this 10 megawatt solar field in a desert in Abu Dhabi powers a whole university with laboratories 24 hours, 7 days a week. It's an experiment, but it demonstrates that potential. What if that potential was harnessed in terms of those cities, that part of humanity that I was talking about? And power is so central, energy central to that issue. What if we were able to use the technology of the car, which is totally self-sufficient, if we were to harness the photovoltaics, the solar energy, and integrate together all those elements which are about heating, cooking, instead of there being separate pieces of kit generating heat, which is wasted, but compacted, that could transform the quality of life. It could be applied from one side of this wall in a South American city to the other side. It could also empower and transform the lives of those in rural communities who have no option but to seek the city. So it could transform their lives. It could bring power to light and cook. And I think the good news is that although we're dependent on the fossil fuel, that is declining in investment, and the solar is also declining in cost. It's becoming more accessible. And it's interesting that you cannot separate the production, the harvesting of that energy from the storage and reuse of the energy over the cycle of the day and the night. And if China is leading the world in solar, it's also quite interesting to just look ahead and see who's investing in batteries. And with the exception of Tesla on the left, you can start to see the emergence of those production facilities. So this is not just talking about the future, this is how the future is being acted on at the moment. And it's very fashionable to talk about the one planet Earth and how many planets can humanity survive on. The red here are those who are consuming more than the land that they're occupying can generate. And they are dependent on the greens, the green areas, who make the red areas possible. And what happens when those green areas become red? How many planets can we sustain? We have to do more with less. It's a mantra. I owe it to Buckminster Fuller. But that trend we see around us. I remember in the 80s being one of the first people in London to have a mobile phone, and I carried it. It was a heavy metal box, and I remember placing it on the table in a committee meeting that I was going to, and everybody gathered around, and they were kind of entranced by this new piece of kit. And in no time, we've seen that phone distill down into something which we now take for granted, and it does so many more things than just a phone. So we have to move, in terms of the environment, in that similar style, to do more with less, and in the process of doing, to have more pleasure, to have a greater quality of life. There's no doubt that that little thing that I have in my pocket gives me more pleasure, more access, more information, more of everything than that metal box which I carried around into that committee. If I give some examples, and hopefully it will come out in the discussion, we could rethink our agriculture. We could bring the agriculture closer to the city. We can have high-rise agriculture. It's 11 times more efficient. Hydroponics. Obviously, we're seeing the trend. I remember going to China in the 1980s, with bicycles everywhere. Now it's cars everywhere. At the same time, we're reintroducing the bicycle, and I think China is probably rediscovering that too. And it's not about how much you spend, it's about how wisely you spend it. It's about design. If you take the city of Bogota, where they could not afford to create an underground network, but they took the lessons of mass transit and they applied it to buses, so you could buy your ticket in advance. And by this, they had 93% reduction in traffic fatalities, 40% drop in air pollution, 32% shorter, and huge acceptance, and really mass travel. And if we converted our waste into energy, this by BIG, great architects in Copenhagen, is a ski slope, but is also processing the city's waste and converting it into power, into electricity. It's not polluting the planet by digging holes and landfill. It's not carting it off with expensive transportation. So I believe that these examples, and there are many, many more, should inspire us to change our cities from this linear input of resources and pushing it all out as waste, to bring us into a more circular cycle where the cities become more self-sufficient and in the process improve that quality of life. So I believe that cities can change the world. They're doing so for good, and that at the risk of repetition, that small changes can make a huge difference, and that design and technology are the keys to that. It's about different skills acting together. It's about civic leadership, and that cities are the future now. So I'm very optimistic. Thank you.